Welcome to Chapter 9, Leadership. Leadership is different from management. You can think of a yin-yang symbol where there's two sides of the circle, and management is one side and leadership is the other side. Together they form the whole, and a person has both management and leadership available to them, inside of them, and together those form the whole of the person. And leadership, in this way of thinking about things, is influencing another person to commit to the task of the organization. Influencing the person so they want to do what needs to be done for the organization, the task, what's important. Management, we covered earlier, especially in the motivation chapters. Management is, how do I get this other person to do what I want them to do? Again, for the organization, for the benefit of the task, what the organization is set up to do. It's how it's configured, its systems, its structures. We'll get to structure later. So, management, how do I get someone to do what I want them to do? And the answer is usually, well, I'll motivate them, either intrinsically or extrinsically, and sometimes with a punishment. Leadership is not about punishment, it's about influencing the other to want to do what needs to be done. So now we'll look at leadership. Well, here are the textbook's first few ideas about leadership as presented in Chapter 9. And it is about influence. The definition of leadership almost always starts with that word influence, and it should. And we're influencing that other person. Now, the textbook does say leadership is about motivating people and gaining their commitment. I agree with the commitment part, commitment to the task of the organization, the important thing that the organization is set up to do. I don't agree about the part that says it's about motivating people. I think that's management. And I think that confuses things when you use the word motivating when you talk about leadership. But we're going to take, the textbook's point of view with a little bit of commentary from me. And then strategic leadership. So leadership is often thought of as a high-level occupation and activity in organizations, that there are senior leaders, that when a person rises higher in a hierarchy, they become a leader by definition, whereas I wouldn't agree with that. I would say leadership can happen anywhere in the organization because influence can happen anywhere in the organization, just as motivation, management can happen anywhere. So try not to get confused with the idea that leadership only occurs at the top of an organization, or that you can be promoted into leadership. You may be promoted into a job, a role that requires more influence, and therefore that's leadership. But that doesn't make a person a leader automatically. It is not a magical thing where you are anointed, you become this leader person. Even though you may work in organizations that use that term, team leader, I don't know how they're used, but often organizations will use that word, and academically, I would argue that it's often used inappropriately to signify a position or a level in a hierarchy, not the activity of influencing others to want to commit to the task that needs to be done. It says right in the bottom bullet point, strategic leaders focus on the future. I definitely agree with that. Leadership is all about the future. Leadership is not about predicting the future. It's about making the future. Whereas managers, their job can be to predict what might happen. How can we get ready for that? Leadership takes a different point of view. Remember the yin yang idea. These are both required. And predicting the future is a good thing to try, even though it's almost impossible. But the effort is worthy because the effort can help you learn. So management predicting the future is fine, even though they can't do it. But leaders try to make a future. And can they do that? Yes. I mean, that's the essence of leadership, is to build a new future, to make a new future, to select a vision of what could be, and to work to make that happen with and through others in the organization. And that vision can be a positive thing. We hope it's a positive thing. But it can turn out to be a negative thing, either from the leader's own point of view or from the point of view of others, looking from the outside in, which is much more likely that others will evaluate a leader's vision as being the wrong one. But leaders might not, and probably don't, see their own visions that way. So leadership is about a focus on the future and making that future, creating a new future. Well, this slide starts off looking at the difference between formal and informal leadership. And as you can see at the top, formal leaders have been given a title, have been given the role. There's some sense of, yes, this is appropriate. You are expected to exert influence over others to get them to commit. We can call those others employees. Like I said one time before, we typically don't use the word subordinates anymore, which used to say leaders and subordinates, but now you would say leaders and others, leaders and team members, leaders and associates, things like that. So, leadership involves going beyond formal role requirements to influence others. It's more than being given the title. It's a desire to influence, to create change. Leadership is essentially about change in organizations. Remember the idea of the future, building a new future. So change is always part of that, because where we are in the present is not where we want to be from the leader's point of view in that future that's going to be built. So it's a process of change. Leadership is always about change. So you can be given the title, but you have to do the actions, and the actions are part of how you think and what you believe. It's leadership is a philosophy. And informal leadership, these are people who influence but have not been given a formal title or role by the organization. And yet they're still leaders. So this might explain the case of people who are lower in a hierarchy and are influencing, but people may not even know they're doing it. Still, they're having an impact. Shared leadership, we talked a little bit when we did teams, when we did the chapter on groups and teams, that teams are defined by sharing leadership. That a person will step up in a team when that person's skills are required and help the team move forward. And then when the situation has changed, when the problems have been resolved, that person will step back into the team and another person will step forward. Sometimes teams are self-led in the sense that there is no formal team leader. Sometimes there is a formal team leader, and yet there is still shared leadership. Informal leaders must rely on being well liked or being perceived as highly skilled. We'll see these ideas in the chapter on power, on the bases of power. One is expertise, that's the highly skilled part, and one is referent power, that's the well-liked part. So you have to have power to exert influence, and power is fine. We'll talk about that again later. This chapter, like most chapters on leadership in organizational behavior textbooks, is a history of leadership thought. And it starts with the earliest academic writings and thinkings on leadership from the current era, which is late 1800s, early 1900s would be the start, to the present day. So 130, 40 years, something like that. And of course, there's always been leadership. It's just we don't have academic study of leadership to the same degree we do today. So we have a history of leadership thought, and we're going to go over a number of theories, quite a few theories of leadership, because as every generation of academics comes to the fore, they come into their productive years, their job is to think deeply about organizations and essentially to invent theories that explain what they think is happening and maybe what should happen, how things could be better, like Weber and bureaucracy theory. Organizations could be better structured in Weber's point of view, right? So the first one is the trait theory. World War I, you don't need to know a lot about that, but basically there were a lot of soldiers fighting, millions, and you need many hundreds of thousands of leaders, people to influence others. Now, definitely using rewards and punishments. Rewards would be like the ribbons you get, medals for valor. Napoleon is famous for saying something like, it's amazing what you can get people to do for a few bits of colored cloth, which are the ribbons that soldiers or other military people will wear to designate their service and maybe awards they've been given. And punishments, of course, in the military. If you don't do what you're ordered, there can be severe punishments. And in World War I, people were executed for that, for not following orders. So we need lots of leaders in World War I. So academics and government people are being asked, well, how do we get lots and lots of leaders, because they're dying, right? The ones we have are being killed because you're leading from the front. And these low-level leaders are the first ones over the parapet, out of the trench to lead an assault against the enemy into machine gun fire, and so they didn't live very long. So we need more. Well, one thought was, let's find out what they are, what leaders are, and we'll call those traits. And once we know what they are, we can select people for having those traits, and we'll have leaders like quite quickly, quite easily. A little bit of training and they're ready to go. So that was the idea. And during the war and World War II, and this research went on for some time, and they found lots of traits that were connected to being able to successfully influence others. Lots of traits were connected to leadership. It got to be so confusing. There's so many situations, there's so many traits. One study looked at traits like through the dictionary. They went through an English dictionary and looked for words that described traits of people. And the way I remember this, they found about 5,000 such words for traits. Well, that's a large, large number to say which ones of those are the most important. And, remember that a lot of this is happening all the way from the First World War, which is 1914 to 1918, all the way up into the 1940s, early 1950s, early, mid, late 50s. And there essentially were no computers. So the research had to be done. A lot of it was being done by hand. And that slows things down tremendously. And, mistakes get made. And so the kind of research you can do was affected by the tools you have. So trait research just bogged down. It just had nowhere to go. It's like, we don't know. We think there's some traits that are really important, but it's so confusing. Sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. And in certain situations they seem to work, and in others they don't, but they could, depending on, it was too hard. Now, the next slide gives us some traits that the textbook says are associated with leadership effectiveness. So why do we have that list? I think it's 9 traits. Essentially, from my point of view, what happened was computers. And in the 60s, we started to get the first computers available for general use, IBM mainframes. I was trained on an IBM 36050, and it's a large computer that can do a lot of things. And, it had a lot of storage for its day. So what that means is, as an academic, you can now give people thousands of questions to answer about their own personality and traits, and you can measure their effectiveness by asking people who work for that person hundreds of questions, and you can use the computer to do factor analysis to find factors that make a difference across many people, across many situations. And what are the general factors that matter? It used to be that you could get a PhD by doing one factor analysis because it took so long to do it by hand, months. Whereas when I was doing my PhD, you just ran a factor analysis program, and a couple of minutes later you get your result. So that's why we now have some new research on traits. I'll talk about that in the next slide. Here's that nice list of 9 traits associated with leadership effectiveness. Lots of evidence has led to this. So here you go. Intelligence, energy and drive, self-confidence, dominance. You want to influence others. Motivation to lead. Again, I'd say you want to influence others. Dominance is like a psychological trait that it's just built into you. That's a natural thing for you to dominate or control others. Whereas motivation to lead, maybe you can learn that a little more. Emotional stability. You're not up and down all the time. You're fairly constant at a reasonable level. Honesty and integrity, need for achievement, and sociability, getting along with people. Okay, I'd like to ask you a question now. If you had to pick your top 3 from this list, what would it be? And you can pause if you would like, because I will give you my top 3. All right, well, if you paused and thought about this, what top 3 did you pick? Well, there's not going to be a right answer. Which ones of these? It's not in the back of the book. It's not like, by the way, there's 3 of these that are really important. But I'll give you my thinking. See if it matches to yours. I would say the number one thing for me would be motivation to lead. That you actually want to influence others. That's that's important to you. In the MBA program in Edmonton, I used to teach first year MBA students for about 7 years or 8 years in a row. I was teaching this first course. And I guess after a year or two, I started to play a little game in my own mind where I'd look at these 70 or so students in the room, because I'd have them like all in the room at the same time for 5 mornings in 1 week in August as they started their course. And I would have time to look at them all, and they would be talking to each other, and they'd make little presentations here and there where I asked people questions. And I would be searching for who's the leader here. And my test was much later, this was August, much later, it would be like February, March, there would be an election for an MBA Association president. And that was my test. Who would get elected? And, the months would go by and I'd have my picks, of who I think top 3 who might get elected. And they weren't. And the next year I'd do it again and they weren't. And like 3 or 4 years in a row, no, it's not work, and I'm thinking to myself, like, I can't be that wrong. Because when I look, I can see who have these traits. Like, it's not that hard to see. I can see who's sociable, who talks to people, at break time, and who seems to be laughing and having fun, and others are laughing with them, not at them. And who seem to be intelligent enough and have energy and drive and so on. So I can't understand why I'm so wrong. It doesn't make sense. How can that be? So one day I asked, after the election, I bumped into this MBA student in the hallway. He was my number 1 pick. And I said to this man, how is it you're not the MBA president? Like, I kind of told him the story. I had him as my pick. And he kind of laughed. And he said, oh, yeah, I've been there, done that. I came from a different university, and I was the undergraduate president of the student association for the whole university. And I did that for a couple of years. And, I've done that. So a couple more years go by, I worked, and now I'm in my MBA. I just decided, I'm going to step back a bit, and I'm going to focus on studies, and I'm going to watch other people. And I know I could, in this case, be the MBA Association president. I know I could lead, if not formally, informally. Just right now, I don't want to. So that's why I pick motivation to lead. Second, I would pick sociability. I was about to pick my third pick, energy and drive. That's my third pick. Sociability. You've got to like people. You've got to get along with people. If you don't like people, leadership is not for you. And that's okay. If you're, it helps to be an extrovert. Introvert, you can do it. You can lead as an introvert, but it's going to be tiring. So you have to build in time to recharge. We'll cover some of that in the stress chapter. Sociability, very important. And my number 3 is energy and drive. Leadership is a very high energy business. You must give a lot to others. Leadership is all about giving your energy to other people. Whereas I don't think management is that way. I think management is more, I set the rules, I set the conditions, I tell you what to do. You do it, you get a reward. You don't do it, you don't get a reward. Or maybe I punish you. But I don't think it's that energy sensitive, That's the way I see it. But leadership is all about energy and giving energy to others. Especially when they're, down, lower, the things are not going well. You're the one that has to give them the energy. The way I like to think about it is a nuclear reactor has these carbon rods. And there's the nuclear pile, which is which is throwing off its particles, whatever they are, and into the heavy water, and that is heating up the heavy water, which is then boiling and causing steam to drive a turbine. And you don't want this thing to boil too fast and get too hot because, that can cause a meltdown. So you have these carbon rods that come in to the heavy water pool, and they absorb some of the particles being emitted by the decay of the nuclear pile, and it slows down the reaction. Less of a chain reaction, less boiling. And so you can pull these rods in and out. So it's not hot enough, you pull them out. It's too hot, you push them in. So there's controls, and it's being adjusted all the time to get exactly the right temperature that we want for the boiling of the heavy water. So leadership's like that, I think. When your people are too excited, like they're all running around, what do we do? What do we do? You have to be the dampening effect. It's okay. We can handle this. We're here to do it together. I'm here to help. Everything calms down. And when they're all kind of, oh man, we can't do this. It's awful. It's so late. And then you give them energy. And so you have to get them excited. We can do this. This is really important. How we can do this and get them going. So you have to manage the energy of your team, is the idea. Well, to do that, you have to have lots of energy. So that's my top 3 pick. Others, intelligence. Evidence says that you need to be, fairly intelligent, but usually not too intelligent. If you're way, way above your team in intelligence, it's just hard to connect with them. You'll understand things they can't understand. And so it's difficult. It's going to be more difficult. Self-confidence, yeah, that's going to be important. Because the more you have doubts, the harder it's going to be. A lot of people say that the key is to act. To act to make change, to test, to see what happens. With guidance, with thought, it's not just random, but you think it through, you decide what to do, you do it. And you need self-confidence to do that because you're not sure. And some people say, as a leader, you need to be like how sure do you need to be before you act? So what if you're 0% sure? I don't know. It's a coin toss. I just don't know what will happen. Oh, that's no good. That's just gambling. What if you wait till you're 100% sure? That's no good. That takes too long. Other organizations will act before you, and you'll be catching up all the time, which you don't want to do as a leader. So, the rough rule of thumb would be when you're 70% sure. Maybe it's 65. It's a rule of thumb. When you're 70% sure, act. You're gambling a little bit and that you're 30% not sure. And so you're going to lose 30% of the time, just randomly. And that's okay. Because you've got to win 70% of the time. If you wait till you're 100% sure, you will win 0% of the time. And if you gamble, you'll only win 50% of the time. So that's why it's 70. You need self-confidence to do that. Dominance, motivation to lead. Emotional stability, because it's hard giving energy to other people. It's hard when you're feeling down yourself to act positive. Now, we have a slide coming up much later on authenticity, that you need to be authentic. But that doesn't mean that you can't project an emotion you're not feeling. That's okay. I mean, if you can feel doubt, what you need to give confidence to your team. I always think of a young parent with a young child, and there's a severe thunderstorm, boom, boom, lightning. That was last night. And the child, runs into the parent's room. I'm scared. And you can imagine a parent who says, yeah, I know, right? Wow, this thunderstorm, it is scary. I don't know. Well, what's the kid going to do? They're going to freak. And the parent might be thinking, yeah, this is bad. but they have to project confidence, emotional stability. They have to be able to do that. Yeah, it's okay. We'll be okay. It's a strong house. We've been through thunderstorms before. We'll be fine. It is. It rattles the walls. You're right about that. But, this house was built for this. Honesty and integrity. Need for achievement. You've got to want to make a difference. Sociability I talked about. Honesty and integrity. I think that's a nice to have. And it's probably in the textbook because, they have to take an optimistic point of view. But if you read the newspapers, lots of people leading organizations or who are leaders are not honest or do not have integrity. And from other people's point of view, they do the wrong thing. So I would have that one rated lower because I think it's more variable. Here's a textbook slide on limitations of the trait approach. And they call it leadership categorization theory. Earlier I called it leadership prototypes. The idea that some followers can have in their minds what a leader looks like, what a prototypical leader looks like, both physically and how they act. And that can be a problem because sometimes people are put into leadership roles or given that power when they have the traits but not the actual performance. And sometimes people who don't have the traits aren't given the opportunity to lead. So those are drawbacks to over-reliance on traits. Well, after trait theory was kind of abandoned until its resurrection later when computers came along, the next big set of studies on leadership was on leadership behaviors. And the question was basically, okay, we've given up on traits. It's not who leaders are. Well, maybe it's what they do. Maybe leaders do things that differentiate them from managers. Maybe that's what makes them different. And so we have Ohio State University studies in the 1940s. And we're talking about hundreds of studies. And they basically look at a whole bunch of people who are in leadership roles. And as time goes by, and we're talking, many, many papers, many PhDs awarded, they found two categories of behavior that leaders engage in. And you can see consideration and initiating structure. So people and the task. It seems pretty straightforward now, but coming out of the mix-up with trait theory, which was just a big confusion, this was like, okay, we've got something to hold on to here. Leaders have to be considerate of their people. They have to care. Seems straightforward. And they have to care about the task, doing the job. Again, seems straightforward. But you can't do only one. And maybe that's less straightforward. Because you may have people who are supervisors or, in charge of you in the sense of you report to them, who focus on one of these and not both. So a person like that can be very considerate and caring, but not do enough on the task, which is a problem from the organization's point of view. This is not a country club. This is a place where we do work to get things done that make a difference in society. And on the other hand, if all the person does in the management leader role is focus on the job and not care about people, well, that can have negative effects on job satisfaction, people quitting, being absent, all those things we talked about. So it's being able to do both. Well, imagine Bob House working with another professor, Martin Evans, at the University of Toronto. And then later there was a professor from Washington, also Terence Mitchell. But in the early days, I think it was Evans and House, both at Toronto, but before I got there. And, they're working away trying to understand organizations better, and in this case, developing a new understanding of leadership behavior, but contingent on situations. So they're reading what's called the literature, all the articles that exist at the time and that have been published relevant to this. And they're talking to each other and students. And they basically, over time, are developing a model, a way of thinking. And you can see at the bottom the picture. This is like the final or the articulated model. And their first question is, well, what do leaders do? Well, look at the list there. Let's do it that way. Directive, supportive, achievement-oriented, and participative. Well, have you seen any of those before? You can pause if you want. Well, directive and supportive we just saw. That was the Ohio State studies. And I think Bob House got his PhD, if I recall, I'm doing this by memory, I think it was in like 1960 from Ohio State. So he'd be well aware of all of this. And even if he didn't, everyone was well aware of that. So he pulled those two straight from there. Achievement-oriented, that came from McClelland, theory of motivation, need theory. Achievement orientation, need for achievement. And participation, we haven't seen yet. But about 3 slides from now, there's a diagram by Tannenbaum and Schmidt, employee participation in decision making, and the year on that's like 1958. So even though in our book it comes a bit later, it was already in existence when Evans and House did this work. So there's 4 leader behaviors. Well, why those 4? Because the literature had said these ones seem important. Again, hundreds of studies and other academics' theories and thoughts. And you could have more, but you don't want too many more. It gets too complicated. Very hard to test when you add many more variables. There's a thing called Occam's razor, O-C-C-A-M, Occam, William of Occam, a philosopher. You could look it up on Wikipedia. Everything's there. And the best I ever heard about Occam's razor was in respective variables in an academic theory. As many as you must, as few as you dare. So don't put in too many variables. Try to keep it as low as possible. But you can't go too low. That's the dare part. Because then you're missing something important. Explaining behavior that's important. So 4. They picked 4. Could have been 3, could have been 5. Couldn't have been, 2, that was covered with behavior theory. Directive and supportive. So it had to be more than 2. And anything more than 5 would have been too complicated for the day. Especially for the day. Because, what year were we in? Late 60s. So there were computers, but maybe not widely held and maybe not easily accessed, especially for academics that didn't, grow up with computers. Definitely late 60s, I was using computers. But not like, no obviously laptops or anything like that. No desktops, no laptops, all mainframes or mini computers accessed through remote terminals or punch cards. So not easy is basically the message. Anyway, so 4. And then what situational factors should we consider? Well, they must have talked about this a great deal. And they came up with employee characteristics. What are the people like that a leader works with, and the environment, the context, the situation, the task. And the basic idea is that a given leader should vary their behavior, these 4 kinds of behavior, not just any behavior, based on the leader's reading of the situation, but not the whole situation, because in perception we learned the whole situation is incredibly complex. So let's narrow it down to just the employee and the environment, the task, and just look at those. And if you do that right, if you do that fit right, the right behaviors given the right context situation, you'll get good outcomes. Because remember, in organizations, we always want these good things. They're always the same. Job satisfaction. We always want that because people quit less. They come to work. Effort. They'll work hard. You know, we learned before that hard work is a direct factor to performance. And acceptance of the leader so that your influence can work now and in the future. So that's the basic model. We're going to look at it in more detail in the next couple of slides. Path goal theory has been called a complementary theory because you're supposed to vary your behavior depending on what's missing in the context, in the person, the employee. So be directive, supportive, achievement-oriented, and participative as required for the given context and person, the follower, the employee, the other. And if the task is already giving lots of direction, like it's obvious what to do, well then don't be directive. They don't need that. If the task is ambiguous, uncertain, it's not clear exactly what to do, then be supportive. If your employees are pretty skilled and they know what to do, then let them participate. And if they have built-in need for achievement, and you've either hired them to have that, or they just have come that way into a team you've inherited, well then use that to your advantage and be achievement oriented. Emphasize what we can do together to make this difference in the world. When I arrived at the University of Toronto in 1976 in the fall, there were older PhD students working on the path goal theory. And they were trying to prove these predictions true by studying real leaders in real organizations with real followers. And you can see the problems they ran into, even with a fairly limited set of predictions with 4 behaviors, 2 context situational factors, and 3 outcomes. That's a lot of variables to measure. And when you have a lot of variables, it means you need a lot of data points to run a regression to get like significant results, meaningful results. And when you need a lot of data points, it means a lot of time and a lot of effort to gather those and to get good data, like that's not made up, that people weren't in a rush to fill out a questionnaire and things like that. So I do recall it was difficult for them. So here are the predictions. Vary your behavior based on the characteristics of your people. Here it says employee. We would say people, followers, others, typically not say subordinates. And the environment. Vary your behavior depending on the environment. And you can read what it says. It makes sense. It's like, that's the prediction for you, is look at your people. Look at the kind of work they have to do. Consider how you can help them by telling them what to do, sometimes directive, supporting them emotionally and with the task sometimes, appealing to their achievement orientation, and giving them participation. So you've got these 4 sliders, and you're going to move these sliders up and down for each of your people individually to try to get the right things they need for the particular situation they're in. So this is not leadership you do for a whole group. This is for each individual person. And if Pathical theory works, you should get those good outcomes. So that's how you would try to use this in practice. There is a third situational leadership theory from this time period of the mid-1970s. And to understand that one, we have to first understand a little bit about employee participation in decision making. And I mentioned this chart, a fairly famous one by Tannenbaum and Schmidt from the Harvard Business Review, 1958. And, not complicated, but basically it says you have this range of participation that you can allow the people who work for you. And I don't know if it says subordinates there, but anyway, manager makes decision and announces it. That's more on the manager end of this continuum. Then you sell it, present your ideas and invite questions, present tentative decision subject to change, present problem, get suggestion, makes decision, defines limits, ask group to make decision, and permits employees to function within limits defined by the superior, the leader. We used to say superior subordinate all the time. So this is the start to another theory that's coming up. Well, why would we want to have more participation in decision making, or situationally to vary it? The 3 outcomes there: motivation, quality, and acceptance. We want people who are motivated, who want to do the task. We want quality, and we want people, the followers, to accept the decision. So these are outcomes that we can measure. And what are the problems that you might encounter if you are participative with your people? Well, time and energy. It takes more time to be participative. Being autocratic, telling people what to do, that's super fast. And it's super tempting to just want to tell people because, it's quick, it's easy for you. And there's a place for it. The typical example when something's on fire, it's an emergency. It's super time sensitive. Telling people what to do makes a lot of sense in those situations. Loss of power. Sometimes the leader, the person in that role, will feel like they're losing their power and authority if they let other people, followers, do more. And lack of receptivity or knowledge. If your others, your followers, aren't receptive to direction or to their participation, some don't want to participate, then it will work less well. Or they don't have the knowledge in a particular task. And you tell them or ask them to participate and they don't know what they're doing, they can't do well. So it's like we've done a literature review on everything that was known about participation at the time. And there were academics who then used that to build a model of how leaders should vary the amount of participation they allow the others, the followers, in given situations to achieve the outcomes that we want, which are the quality and the acceptance and the motivation, but mainly quality and acceptance. So that's coming up in the next slides. The textbook talks about Victor Vroom and Art Jago developing this model. And I met Art Jago But it was actually Victor Vroom and Philip Yetten who started. Philip Yetten was a graduate student of Victor Vroom's at Carnegie Mellon University, and I think it's Pittsburgh. And they developed this situational model of participation. It was called the Vroom-Yetten model. And I think it was like 1973, 74 that this model was published. And here on this slide, you can see they've taken Tannenbaum and Schmidt's continuum of various levels of leader participation with the group and given them names and codings: autocratic, consultative, and group orientation. So those are the ways a leader can act with a decision that's being made by a group. You don't have to focus heavily on this slide and understanding the whole picture. It's quite complicated. And the year, this is Vroom and Jago 1988 from a book, but the basics of this come from earlier, as I said, in the mid 70s. And as I said, I was a PhD student at Toronto then, and of course Bob House, being a senior person in the field of leadership, he knew Victor Vroom, who was from Montreal initially, but was working at Yale. And, all these people know each other. And Victor Vroom had sent Bob House a paper that he and Yetten had submitted to, I think, the Journal of Applied Psychology, a top journal. And it was, I think it was either just accepted or had been submitted and was under review. But the key to the story is Bob House had this paper before it was published. And one day, he, as a PhD student, he was talking to me and he said, for your thesis, maybe you could test this theory that Yetten and Vroom are working on. And, I said, well, that sounds like a good idea. So I went on to try to test this model. So it's not as complicated as it looks. It basically says on the left-hand side, just follow along for a minute, you state the problem. So this is a decision-making leadership model. You state a problem, and really what you're trying to do is decide how much participation to use. Now all the little boxes in yellow and orange there are decision points where you ask a question. And you could follow the decision tree. At the end of each branch, there's a code that we had on the previous slide. Autocratic 1 or 2, group 1 or 2, consultative 1 or 2. And so it tells you, given that pattern of 7 or 8 characteristics, it was 7 when I did mine, it tells you what leader behavior you should use in terms of how much participation to allow when that decision gets made. Either you do it by yourself, you ask your group to consult in different ways, or you give it to the group for them to decide. So you can see that this can be tested. And the way I did it was develop a number of situational problems that varied these situational characteristics. I had people who allowed me to use groups, student groups in universities, and I would give groups a number of problems, and I would tell the leader, here's how you must solve the problem, by telling them which of these styles to use. And sometimes the style was the correct one according to the theory, it fit. And sometimes the style I told them to use was not the correct one. The group made a decision and had to write it down, and I had people who would code the accuracy of that decision. And then I was able to test if you fit the model's prescriptions, were your answers better in terms of quality and acceptance yeah, I think it was mainly quality, how the decision was made, compared to when your method used did not fit the model's prediction. And, basically the model turned out to work. It had predictions that worked. Leader-member exchange theory is kind of the last situational leadership theory from the late 60s, 1970s, maybe early 1980s. Basically said that there is a contingency that leaders treat people differently in groups and teams. And there are some people who have a high quality relationship with the leader. They're members of the in-group, and they're asked to do more, but they're also given more. And when interesting, useful jobs come up where they can be pushed forward into view by others in the organization and possibly get ready for promotion, the in-group is likely to be the people who are given those opportunities. And leaders also have relationships with people in their groups and teams that are in the out group, and that person doesn't do more than the minimum, what's required, and is also not given extra opportunities. So the relationship with the leader is either intense and supportive both ways in the in-group, or pretty routine and formalized when the members in the out-group. So I think this kind of led to ideas of transactional and transformational leadership, which came up later historically and comes up in our next slides, that sometimes a person who we can call leader has a management orientation with a person and treats them as, in LMX theory, is called the out-group. And it's just a transaction. You do this for me and I'll do that for you. And it's a give and take relationship. It's very straightforward. It's not personal. And so that is then going to be called transactional leadership. And transformational leadership would be more the relationship with the in-group members, where the person learns and grows and changes in interaction with the leader, and that's supported by the leader, and more is demanded of that in-group member. So from LMX point of view, do you want to be in the in-group or the out-group if you have a leader? And it's a choice, because there isn't a right answer. If you want more, you want to be in the in-group. That means a closer personal relationship. It means you have to be willing to give more. It means when the leader asks for help beyond normal kinds of things, in the sense of it's still organizationally related, but I need you to work the long weekend. I need you to fly to Omaha, and I need you to go and make a presentation for me. And you don't necessarily want to do that, but you'll do it because your leader has asked for that, and in the in-group, there's an implicit agreement. You're going to do it. Or do you want to be in the out-group and just have a basic transactional relationship and do your job and come to work on time and go home on time and not work on the weekends when you're not scheduled? And if someone calls from work, your manager, your leader calls from work, you don't have to do what they're asking you to do work-wise, because that's not the deal we have. So you get to kind of make that choice, is what this leader-member exchange theory says. Transactional and transformational leadership come in like a pair, and I think it forms like the pair in the yin-yang model that go together, fit together. And therefore, I think of transactional leadership as management. So as you can see, it's a straightforward exchange. It's contingent reward behavior. When you perform, you will get the positive outcome. So it's also reward theory, learning theory. And it's also management by exception. We wait to see what a problem exists, and then the transactional leader will take some action to correct that. So it's straightforward. The other half of the yin-yang model is transformational leadership, which I would call leadership. And I've put it as my number 3 on my top 5 management theory list. Because I think it's right, I think it works, and it's very popular. So this is a later leadership theory. This is late 1980s, 1990s. And the way this was developed, again, by academics who invented the key dimensions, the variables. What do transformational leaders do? The decision was made that they do 4 things. So it's I, C, 3 I's and a C. And we're going to cover these in detail in the next 2 slides. Intellectual stimulation, individualized consideration, inspirational motivation, and charisma. And to me, it just feels like that's what leadership is in today's understanding. We do have some slides later of even later ideas historically that have come up, but this one seems to have stayed in positive thinking for quite some time. It's important that we realize it's about the individual, that the leadership relationship is different for each of your people. And if we look at individualized consideration first, the leader-follower, leader-member relationship that's a one-on-one relationship. And the leader has that one-on-one with each of the people on the team. So I'll use football again for a quick example. There's a coach for the team called the New England Patriots, Bill Belichick. And when Tom Brady, a famous quarterback, used to play there, Bill Belichick said one time that Tom has a relationship with every player in this room. So what he was saying is the quarterback, especially a veteran quarterback like Tom Brady was at the time, is the leader of the team, one of the leaders, but an important one. And that Tom Brady had developed a relationship with each one of the other players. So not just some of them, not just the ones he liked, not just the ones who were senior and had been on the team for some while, that Tom Brady had put effort into developing an individual relationship with each of the players. And the idea is that when times get tough and when we need energy and input and competitiveness, that Tom, the quarterback, can go along the sideline and he can speak to each person as an individual. He can yell at them. He can try to motivate them. He can try to engage them, energize them, and do what's required for the team because he has that relationship, because he invested in that earlier. So in practice, what that might mean was that if a new player is drafted or is traded to the team, Tom Brady can be the one who goes to the airport. And that's the first person this new player sees. The big time quarterback, the player who makes a lot of money, the most important player on the team by position and by seniority, has taken time out of his day to come and meet me at the airport. And then on the way they talk, and maybe they have a dinner, and so there's an investment made. So it's one-on-one, but it is about goal accomplishment. It is about the organization and what you're there to do. Its mission. Treating every individual person as distinct individual. You don't lead on average. Serve as a mentor or coach when appropriate. And you care about them as an individual. At home, at work, the whole person. And then the first one, intellectual stimulation. It's about creativity, novelty, change, this idea of a vision of what we could be, what we want to be, what we need to change to become. Inspirational motivation is about vision again, communicating that vision of what could be, a strong vision of the future based on values and ideals. So we saw some of this in the culture chapter. Stimulate enthusiasm, challenge followers with high standards. So again, that's need for achievement. Communicate optimism, that's the energy of a leader. Provide meaning, why is this important? Because we need commitment to the task, right? Leaders influence others to commit to the task. And they inspire followers to do more. And they use symbolic actions and persuasion. So culture as well. And the last, the C, charisma. It's a personality trait, but it's also something that can be learned. And every person has some degree of charisma available to them. It's kind of like the light switch, the rheostat, the dimmer switch, that we have a natural setting on our charisma given to us by genetics and upbringing. And once we're an adult, that's kind of a default. That's our setting. Like when you have a switch at home that's on a dimmer and you just push the switch in and out, ching ching, the light comes on at a certain setting. But with charisma as a leader, you can increase it or decrease it, and you can do that on purpose. So charisma is something you use to connect with people, to energize them, and to influence them. Charisma provides the emotional aspect of transformational leadership. This is important. Emotions matter. Feelings, emotions. It's not just logic. Yin yang again. Logic's important. That's in the management side. Emotions are important. That's on the leadership side. Both make the whole. So if you're disposed to thinking of emotions as, unimportant, they have no place in the world of work. The message here is, well, we don't agree. People in organizational behavior, which are academics, yes, but also consultants and also managers, people actually doing, real work, think that emotions do matter at work. So that's something you need to think about if you disagree. Well, this next group of slides is what's called new and emerging theories of leadership or positive leadership. And we have empowerment, ethical leadership, authentic leadership, and servant leadership. And these all come from articles or books in maybe the 1990s, the thousands, 2010s maybe. So what the textbook's trying to do is say, historically, we've gone through this long path of all this study of leadership, and here's where we've been recently. And so here's things to think about. So empowerment. Could have been called participation before. Sharing actual power with your people. giving them autonomy and making decisions, helping them with that, making them feel that empowerment, feeling of control over their work and that they can make a difference. And builds in them that sense of self-efficacy. They feel it in themselves that they can make a difference. Adaptability, job performance, creativity. So all things we would recognize as fairly positive approaches and I would say fairly well recognized ideas of how to lead others. Well, leadership is about a vision for a better future and changing to get to that better future, to make it happen. And it's about the decisions that are made along the way. And every decision can be thought of as having an ethical component. What's the right thing? What's best in this situation? For society, for the individuals involved, what's the right thing to do? And so the idea of ethical leadership is that, first of all, the choice of the vision of the future has to be an appropriate ethical one. We're trying to build a future that's best for everyone. And, a future that people want to live in. And then the decisions that are made along the way. An ethical leader will model what's the right thing to do. There's a book by Simon Sinek called Leaders Eat Last. And I was familiar with this idea from my father, who was in the Second World War, who told me that in the Canadian Army, that was a principle, that officers ate after the enlisted. So sometimes there wasn't enough food to go around. And the whole idea was you take care of your people first, and then you take care of yourself. And that was something that was taught as a deeply held value. So you have to model that. When you're the leader, you have to do that. You have to show that. You make ethics salient in the workplace. That means the ethical component of decision making has to be part of each decision. It has to be considered so that we get the right future that we're trying to build. They set the standards of how to behave, how to decide. They reward ethical behavior. So when I see people doing the right things, I tell them that I saw that and that was good and that was right. They discipline those who don't follow unethical or ethical standards and punish unethical behavior. So reward and punish. When you see something happening that doesn't fit what you want for the values of your organization, of your unit, your team, and will lead to a future you don't want, you have to stop that behavior. You have to tell people that that's not what you want. In the culture chapter, we had a slide that talked about the values and culture of the Australian cricket team. And one of them was competitiveness, but not, aggressiveness, not crossing the line with opponents, that you respect your opponents. So when the coach of the team hears a member of his team saying the wrong thing to an opponent on the field or off the field, and what's called crossing the line, making it too personal, that statement wasn't appropriate, it's not respecting your opponent, the coach has to say something about it, and that's not the behavior we want. And also clarify what is the behavior we want. How do you have banter, which is, talking on the field to the opponent and about the opponent, but banter that's done in a friendly manner, like you might banter with your friends or your children, and not aggressive sledging. Ethical leaders consider the ethical consequences of their decision. What will happen when I make decisions this way or with this outcome? And lastly, they care about people and the broader society and seek to do the right thing personally and professionally. So again, it's more than just the department, the unit, the organization, it's the society. And it's more than just you or a person at work. It's you at work and you at home, and that you're a whole person. And you can't separate the two. You can't say, well, at work I do these things and they might be considered bad, but I do them because that's just work. And when I'm home with my kids, spouse and kids, I treat them well and nurturing, and I'm a great parent. And at work I'm a different person. So the idea here is it's not like that. You're the same person everywhere, and that person's a good person. Authentic leadership is positive. We want a leader to be themselves, their true self, and also be true with others around them. And this is felt to lead to good relationships that are positive, that people can develop to be their full selves and be their full self at work. So that's what we're after in terms of being authentic. You have a strong internal value system that you live by and bring to work. You're self-aware. So I'll work through the 4 authentic leadership behaviors. You're self-aware. You understand your own strengths and weaknesses, how you affect others. You're clear and transparent in your relationships with those other people. You present yourself as you truly are, not a fake version, not what you imagine people want to see, but your true self. You present that to others. You're open, share your thoughts with them and your feelings. It's mainly in the work context and related to work. You can share some of your feelings about life as well. I'd be careful in oversharing, especially in early relationships with others. Balanced processing, listening to other people, and being objective, especially when people say things that aren't what you expected to hear or what that support your own point of view, which is difficult. And you have strong internal moral standards that guides your behavior, how you act, what you do, the decisions you make. And if you can live that kind of a life at work, the idea is you'll be authentic, you'll have better relationships with your others, your followers, and they'll respect you and value you more, and you'll have good outcomes at work because those relationships will be strong and well developed. There's a book on servant leadership. I think it's Robert Greenleaf. And the idea is that you serve others first. And to me, this is a basic idea of leadership in the modern era. Not that that's practiced all the time, but that's our academic viewpoint of what a leader is, a leader who serves others first in the service of the organization, the mission, the task that needs to be done. It's basically not putting yourself first, but putting the others first. Leadership is all about the others. Leadership can be thought of as pain, and where's the pain in leadership? It's you. It's you, the leader, who bears the pain. I would ask the question about management. Where's the pain in management? It's the other. The other person bears the pain. So managers give pain, and leaders, they're the ones that take the pain for the others. So you're serving first and leading second in servant leadership, empowering and developing people, because you are focused on people in the service of the task of the organization. You're humble about that because it's not about you first. You're authentic, that this isn't a role you're playing. This is how you really are. If you don't feel these items, then you don't want to play being a servant leader. That's not the idea. Accepting others for who they are, giving them direction in their work life, but their life as a whole, and being a steward, responsibly overseeing and protecting the assets and the people. That you do this as a service to the organization and to others, and this you find meaning in your life in doing this and living your life this way. Here's a number of findings and thoughts from the textbook about gender and leadership. Women have been found and tend to be more participative, more democratic than men in organizational settings, more transformational, more developmental of their followers, their others. Men tend to be more on the management side. Using our yin-yang model, women would tend to fall on the yang side of leadership, and men more on the yin side of management. So women can be highly effective leaders in organizations. There are organizations that are more masculine focused, and of course more societies, as we saw earlier, that are more masculine versus feminine. And so those situations, those cultures can tend to reward more male-oriented behaviors. And the more feminine cultures of the world, which are dominated by the Nordic countries, can be led by more female-oriented traits. And men and women do not differ in their perceived leadership effectiveness when you take all these factors into account. We have three slides now on women and leadership and the traits that women and men are perceived to have, and then a slide on the advancement of women in organizations. So as is commonly known, if you're looking at the top leadership positions in large organizations, in Canada, the United States, other countries, not all countries, but you tend to see men in those positions. The first bullet point says, among the top 500 companies in the world, only 3% have female chief executive officers. So I don't find that surprising because we're dealing with extremely large organizations, and it's very competitive to become the leader of those organizations. Although some of them are family-oriented, many of them are open organizations in the market and the stock market, and so they're large and competitive. And men in many cultures of the world find competitiveness something they like to do. So that's not surprising to me when we're looking at the very, very large organizations. I think you should find more women leadership in terms of a percentage when we get to the medium and smaller organizations. Also, we're looking at leadership here as the very top position, in this case, the chief executive officer. Well, there's only one of those persons in an organization, and we academics, we believe that leadership exists throughout the organization. So I would say that leadership is something that happens throughout for men and for women. Second bullet point talks about the glass ceiling. You may have heard that idea, that there's a barrier that women can't advance through. And there's been quite a lot written about that. Of course, objectively, most people do not advance through that ceiling to become the top level of an organization. There's only a very few people that advance to that top level. And so most of us don't reach that ceiling. And then the third bullet point to some research done by Alice Eagley and Linda Carley about a labyrinth, the organizational labyrinth. And that's likely worth looking into in the textbook, and there's some research that supports that idea. Role congruity theory. Role congruity theory. We've dealt with that before. That idea of prototypes, that there's a set of role requirements, and people have perceptions of what's required in a role, in this case a senior leadership role, and that perception is that men fit that pattern maybe in general better than women do. We should find that goes away a little bit over time as a particular person becomes known in an organization. Then they're not seen so much as a man or a woman first, but as a person first. And so we'll look at the agentic and communal traits next. I think agentic means an agent, someone who acts on things and who makes things happen. And communal is collective, it's the togetherness approach. And this is all about perception, that men are perceived to be more agentic, and certain cultures will teach men to be more agentic. And women are perceived, again, to be more communal and are likely to be taught to be more communal in some cultures, just to different extents. And the Nordic cultures, again, would teach all people to be more communal and would value those traits. And women who exhibit and hold those traits can tend to rise more easily to senior positions in organizations because those traits are perceived and valued. The agentic trait of long hours is, I think, an interesting one because men, in this case, are perceived to have that trait. Large organizations value long hours, and they value commitment to the organization, dedication to the organization, essentially living your life for the benefit of the organization. We're talking large organizations. And if we're dealing again with the top largest 100, largest 500 in the whole world, these indeed are very large organizations with many thousands usually of employees and many billions of dollars of assets and sales. And so whoever is willing to dedicate their life to the organization has a better chance of rising to the senior levels in that organization. So there's a question to ask. Are you willing to devote your life to the service of the organization, to spend the 40 some years required to reach the top? Is that something you value? This exhibit is from a Harvard Business Review article from 2007. Academy of so that's 13 years ago. This is not yesterday's news. This has been going on for some time. And you can see the authors, Mansoor Javed. And here's some advice for how you can advance women in organizations. It's clearly good advice for how to advance Peter Dorfman in organizations. And in this case, and Bob, the researchers were focused on women. So here are the
So
dimensions,
let's
and you can
look at these
recognize
points.
some of the
Increase
Hofstede
people's
dimensions
awareness
in this list
of the
this
drivers
was developed
of
prejudice
by the central
in this
group
case
over
towards
time
female
in a
leaders.
theoretical way.
So
These
we
are the
should
dimensions
reduce
we want
all
to look for.
prejudices,
And then they wrote
judgments
questions
about
based in part on
people in
Hofstede's
organizations
questions
and what's holding
and
them
others.
back.
And they
from
tested
being
those
perceived
questions, and
as
then in some countries where a different
useful,
language was used, there was
competent people.
translation.
Change the
and
long
back
hours
translation.
norm.
So you translate into the local language.
So this is interesting.
This
and
is
then
about
you hire a
work-life
different person
balance,
to translate
and do
back
you have
into
to
English.
dedicate
and you
your
compare
entire
the
life to the
translated
organization,
English to the original English to look for differences and fix those. I'm not sure organizations,
So,
the very largest ones,
They
can
developed a whole set
successfully
of
do
questions, and these were the
That's me.
questionnaires
That's
that
my
every
thinking. I'm thinking of
researcher
Japan
used
in particular,
in their country,
where the long hours
so that the
norm
data is
entrenched,
consistently asking the same
and the
questions.
idea that
In these
in this
different
case,
countries,
men can
of
only
middle
men can be
managers
the leaders
always
of those organizations.
in target in
Clearly, we
industries,
could
in one
change
of these
that,
three industries.
the idea of men and women, that they can both lead the organization. But the long hours norm, I'm not sure how easily that can be changed in a country like Japan. But the long hours norm has decreased to some extent. I know when my father was growing up in Ontario, working in Toronto, he told me that working Saturday mornings was normal. That was the way everyone worked. The entire society worked Monday to Friday, a regular day, and Saturday morning. And clearly we now, for regular salaried weekly workers, we've gone to a regular work week of being 5 days. Most people today say, have a good weekend, meaning Saturday and Sunday. So that wasn't always true. So maybe we, as a society, will move towards a 4-day week with not the 10-hour days, the 4x10 model, but 4 regular today working days. I think it's a difficult one. Reduce the subjectivity of performance evaluation, always a good idea, right? Reduce bias for all groups of people. Use open recruitment tools. Get lots of people from the society to apply for jobs. And instead of using what's called, they don't call it here the old boys network, but that could be the implication. And that, of course, is a good idea always for diversity, that organizations should recruit from their society to have equal representations in the organization as you find in the society. Ensure a critical mass of women in executive positions, not just 1 or 2 women, to head off the problems that come with tokenism. A token is when there's just one person of a particular type, in this case a woman, in a group. In this case the others would be men. That sole person can feel like a token, that they've been hired into that role simply for the optics, for the organization to be able to show others that we have, in this case, a woman in the senior executive ranks. It's difficult for that person to be in that role, even if they have gotten there not being a token. They've got their on their own, resources, initiative, their abilities. They can still feel that way or be perceived by others as a token, which would be an error, but that can happen because it's perception, and perceptions are easily in error. So it's much better to have more than one of a underrepresented group in this case, a senior management team. Help shore up social capital, which means shoring up means to reinforce or bolster. So help women develop their social relationships at work so that they know lots of people and are supported, therefore, by lots of people. They get mentoring. Prepare women for line management. Line are the people who actually do the work of an organization, and staff are the people who support the work of the organization. So the idea here is that
women need to have experience in line management with demanding assignments so that they have over time developed the set of experience that will be recognized as appropriate for these senior management jobs. If you've always been in the staff, like a lawyer in a regular organization, is a support role. It's a staff role. And you could be a very senior person. You can be on the senior management team as a lawyer, but you won't be the chief executive officer. That's unlikely because you don't have line experience in the factory, doing things, doing the work of the organization. A lawyer in a law firm is different. That's a line. That lawyer is doing the work of the organization and so can lead the organization as the chief executive, which in a law firm is called the managing partner, which is done for a while. Establish family-friendly human resource practices. That's always a good idea. And in this case, for women, it's a good idea because women can tend to be more of the caregiver in a family grouping. And so we need resource practices of the organization that will allow that person, in this case a woman, to do that role at home and still put in the hours at work. Allow employees who have significant parental responsibility more time to prove themselves worthy of promotion. Sometimes there are time limits in professional organizations. There's often a written or an unwritten rule. It's often like 7 years up or out. In consulting firms, this can be true. In law firms, to make partner within 7 years, you either make partner, which is the up, or you're expected to leave, which is the out. Architecture firms, which have partners, in academics, being a professor, it's formally 7 years up or out. Up, you get tenure, or out, you have to leave and go and work somewhere else, some other university, where you can try again on the tenure track or not. So the idea here is, well, why have we picked 7 years in a career that might last 40, 50 years? And in today's world, with longer lifespans, I'm expecting 50-year work lives to become normal, that people will work to essentially 75. Here in Alberta, judges at the courts, I'm told, so I think this is right, they have a retirement age of 75. And I think senators in Alberta, or in Canada's Senate, I think there's a retirement age of 75. So I'm expecting 75 to become the new end of working career standard as opposed to 65. 75 is the new 65. Welcome women back because they sometimes have to take leaves, for example, to have children. And there might be a year's leave, and when the woman comes back from having a child and caring for that child, and now the child is being cared for by others to some extent while the woman's at work, welcome the woman back into the workforce with the same job, the same responsibilities, same prospects for promotion, with added time to prove themselves worthy of promotion because a year has been taken off the clock. So you have to add a year to the clock. In academics, we call the tenure process, the 7 years, we call that the clock. The clock is ticking. That's one of the clocks that ticks. And the other, of course, is the biological clock for women to have children and for men to some extent to have your children when you can earlier is the biological clock. And the last bullet point, encourage male participation in family-friendly benefits. An interesting point, because if men participate in parental leaves, then it's normal. And then when women take parental leaves, it's nothing out of the ordinary. And so women are not perceived as being disadvantaged by taking that leave, and they won't necessarily feel it themselves. So that's the idea in the last point. The last set of slides in this chapter is about culture and leadership, and we're talking now country culture. And do leadership behaviors vary in their effectiveness across the cultures of the world? Well, this is a very difficult question to answer. And a research project was started by an academic, in this case, Bob House, the same Bob House who did path goal theory. By now, he had left the University of Toronto and he had gone to Wharton, the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And I had graduated by then and taken my job at the University of Alberta. And when he started this project called the Globe Project, which still exists and still there's researchers working on this and making presentations at academic conferences every year. I get the emails because I knew Bob House and some others who were involved. There was a professor who led this project called Mansoor Javadan, who used to be a professor at the University of Alberta and then was a professor at the University of Calgary when this project was started, and then became a professor at the University of Arizona, and is still, I think, working on this project. So it's a large global project. Well, how do you get the data from a number of countries? Geert Hofstede, back in the culture work that we talked about in an earlier chapter, he was able to convince one company, IBM, to allow him to give questionnaires to employees of that one company in many countries and study culture that way. Well, those ideas came into the Globe Project based on the dimensions that were found by Hofstede. In this case, the answer was to recruit a team of researchers, academics, from many countries, and to invite researchers to gather the data in their country using the same questionnaire that was developed by a central team working on the Globe Project. So I and my PhD student at the time, Julian Andrews, who's now in Australia, we gathered the data for what's called English Canada. So if you ever see the data and it says English Canada, right, that's us. And you were asked to pick two of three industries, and one was food processing and one was banking, and I forget the third right now. And the idea was that every country has these three industries. And so I think we picked banking and food processing. And the idea then was to get managers, middle managers, not the CEOs, because you won't get them anyway. And someone will fill out their questionnaire for them, typically. So middle managers who will actually fill out the questionnaire. And this was done by mail. And you filled it out with it's called paper and pencil, right? So there's a document, paper and pencil or pen, it doesn't matter, but that's the saying, paper and pencil survey. And they filled out the answers and mailed it back to you. And then you code it all and send the data to the central team who collects the data for all these different countries. So we did that, and in the Globe Project ended up with 61 different countries had researchers who gathered enough data from their country that it could be aggregated and then tested. Well, what did we find when we look at what leader behaviors are considered appropriate and right and successful in that country? What leader behaviors are considered out of bounds, a leader should not exhibit? And are there countries where we find some behaviors, some difference between those answers? So that was the study. Here are the 6 dimensions that we ended up with, because you take all those questions that were written and run them through a factor analysis program, which will mathematically determine which questions and answers go together and form these dimensions that you see. And at the bottom, Canada and the United States score high on charismatic, value-based, participative, and humane-oriented, and low on self-protective and medium on team-oriented and autonomous. So that's what it says here in the textbook. One thing I wanted to say was, the textbook has a Canada, United States, Anglo, Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand, that Anglo point of view. I mentioned that in chapter 1, so that we would expect that. And I'm not aware that there was US data. In the initial Globe survey, the person who was gathering US data dropped out, and I didn't think there was US data, so I'm not sure about that point. It's probably not central, though, to the argument. This exhibit from the textbook on the Globe Project, this is the key right here, that we look at what works in every culture, what doesn't work in every culture based on the answers, and what works in some and not in others. That's the cultural differences. So what works for leaders, no matter which one of these 61 countries? Now, there's other countries in the world. Obviously, there's 193 or so countries, and we only studied 61, but it's a sample. And what works, what's found to work? Trustworthiness, justice, and honesty. That's good everywhere. Having foresight and planning, encouraging, motivating, building confidence, being positive and dynamic, being communicative, working with others, being informed, a coordinator, a team builder. So that's good advice. No matter where you're asked to work in the world, if you follow those 4 bullet points as a leader of individuals and teams, you will be well served. This is a good idea to do those things. And what doesn't work? So the next 3 bullet points, being a loner and not social. That doesn't work anywhere. You can't lead others that way. It's a social business influence. Being irritable and uncooperative. If you don't like people, if you're easily upset, if problems really anger you, and you show your anger, and you start lashing out at others, doesn't say lashing out, but that's the extreme, that's not going to work, because you damage relationships over time that way. Imposing your views on others doesn't work. It's about influence. We're not studying management here. Management is about imposing your views on others. I know best. I rose to this position competitively. I beat everyone here. I know best. I'm following directions from those above me that know best. And this is what you do. And everyone's like, okay, that's management. But when we're talking leadership, it's not like that. It's about influence. And you can't do that. It's the other side of the yin-yang model, the idea. And what works in some cultures and not in others? This is the tricky part. Because like Hofstede has that website, Hofstede Insights, where you compare country cultures, and then you have to figure out, what can I do in some cultures that I can't do in my home culture? So sometimes being individualistic works. The United States would be one example, right? Because they value the individual a great degree. But in other countries, being individualistic is not going to work at all. And Japan has been our common example through this course. And there's other collectivistic countries where being individualistic is not a good idea. Being constantly conscious of status. We talked about status. Constantly conscious, always thinking about your status. How are others treating you? How are you seen? Are you gaining status? Are you losing status? In some countries, that is the way. You've got to do that. If you don't do that, your status erodes and your power erodes, and you can't be effective. You must maintain and build daily your status. In some old time countries, it was honor. And you had to develop your honor and how you were seen by others your whole life. And that's how you had an impact on the world. So you've got to know the status in a country and how it's looked at. And risk taking. In some countries, risk taking is a good thing. Again, the United States. And in Canada, we're a little bit a lighter version. So a little less risk taking, a little less individualistic, but still compared to 193 other countries, we would be higher. So risk taking is valued in some countries where they don't have uncertainty avoidance being high, right? So you're allowed to take risks because we don't mind not knowing what will happen next. But in some countries, taking risks is a bad thing. And they have high uncertainty avoidance, and they don't like risk taking. So you can't do that as a leader in those countries. So this is the key, this chart here for understanding leadership in different cultures. And you'd be well advised when you're dealing with people from other cultures to figure out what is culturally contingent for them. And when you go to another culture, figuring out those 3 culturally contingent points. But no matter who you deal with or where you are in the world, always do the top universal facilitators and always avoid the 3 universal impediments. If you want to be what we're calling a global leader, which is leading people from around the globe in your particular situation, location, company, or moving around the world as a citizen of the world and leading in other cultures, this is the advice we have for you. And things we've talked about already, being able to influence people who aren't like you, come from different cultures. You have to have this mindset of the world has many different ways of doing things, and I have to be adaptable and flexible and change with the new cultures that I'm exposed to and try to be effective in. And it says 4 characteristics that can be useful to you: unbridled inquisitiveness, personal character, duality, and savvy. So unbridled inquisitiveness. You want to learn. Other cultures fascinate you. That's interesting. And you can't wait to find new ways and to experience that. And your character, because you know who you are, so you learn about other cultures, but you don't become them. You know, there's a strong internal core. So you're not changing as you're moving around the world. You're not becoming these different versions of yourself, because that's very tempting to go native in each culture because it becomes easier. But then moving to the next culture, it's multiple personality disorder. You know, I'm kidding there, right? But it would be a problem. Duality, global and local tensions. So you're working for probably a multinational that has global ambitions. You know, it lives in the world. And you're a senior executive in one country, but you have to manage this balance between what's happening in this one country and the global reach of the organization you work for. And this savvy, which means deep knowledge, how to get things done. It's a can-do-it approach. And so you need to have developed this deep knowledge over time. This isn't something that comes easily to a younger person. It's developed. How do you get that savvy and that ability to become a global leader, presumably further down your career path? Well, get some experience in working with different cultures or people from other cultures. Speak more than one language, which you may do already. That would be a help. If you don't, some language training is in order. Uh, it's easy to say, but pick a language that you think is going to be important. It might be Mandarin, it might be Russian, Spanish is always a good choice, French. If you did a Wikipedia list, top languages in the world, like what are the top languages? List the most spoken languages. You'd get some languages there for your consideration. Have an aptitude for global business. Well, I don't know what that means. It's like it always helps to have aptitude, but wanting to do it is probably a good start. Also get some training. So travel to foreign countries first of all, as a visitor. Just, spend some time, go around. You can learn a lot that way if you get experience with locals, as opposed to staying in multinational type hotels where all you meet is English speakers. Get put on teams with members from diverse backgrounds so you can learn about them. Invite them to go out for dinner, to have dinner at your home. Maybe they'll invite you to have dinner at their home. So therefore you would be eating different foods and learn about their cultures. Formal training programs can be useful in organizations, or you can take a training program such as a university degree or a night school course, a community learning type course. Ask for a transfer for what's called here an overseas assignment to another country, another culture, another continent. Get some experience doing that. As a student, you can do student exchanges, student trips. As an intern for a company, you can be hired as a developmental trainee, an intern. So look into that. If you can do that for a longer term, like a year in a country, that can be especially developmental. A few weeks, there's nothing wrong with that. It's a start. But for deep knowledge, it's clearly not going to be enough. And if you live in a multicultural environment like Canada, it's thought that that's an advantage because there are enough cultures here in Canada that you will be exposed to them. And they often say there's a community from different cultural groups in larger Canadian cities, and so you can seek ways to get exposed to their cultures, and that can be an advantage to you. For performing, I decided to emphasize the idea of global teams. And this article was written in 2015. So global teams have been around, obviously for a long time. But global teams are also they're separated by time and distance. So that is something that we're used to now in the COVID era. And they give a structure that's called SPLIT: structure, process, language, identity, and technology. How these things could split teams apart and what you can do to hold them together as they perform, working in different locations. And having to work over technology has its difficulties, and the time zone differences have to be taken into account. So structure. They have to perform well, they have to have a structure. We are one team with a single identity. We know how to work together. We are here for each other. So they've considered these things and come to these agreements. Process, we give lots of feedback to each other. When you have a distance team, you need lots of communication of how things are going. The next one under process is important. We have unstructured time when we can chat with each other. Very often teams set a meeting time, and as soon as the clock ticks, it's okay, we're at work now, let's get to work. Whereas some unstructured time can be helpful. Either before, so set the Zoom meeting so that it starts before the official time of your team or group's meeting, or during a break time, leave the Zoom room open. So if someone needs to go and, get a drink or whatever, they can do so. But if people just want to, kind of relax and have a sandwich and chat, they can do that. We give time to each other to disagree. Don't be in so much of a hurry to get work done that there's no time left for disagreement. It, of course, helps if you've had a lot of that disagreement earlier in the storming stage, but there still has to be conflict and disagreement during the production stage, the performing stage. Language is interesting because people will have different abilities with the language you're using to do the work. That's called the lingua franca, the language that's being used by the organization as an agreement, could be a default. So here in Canada, it's English and French are the official languages, and the University of Alberta uses both. And in many classes, it's defined what it's going to be. So Faculty Saint-Jean, it's going to be the default language, often French. And when you sign up for the course syllabus would be in French, and you would be told this course will be done in French. And the same is true for other courses in other faculties would be in English. So some people have English as their first language. They grew up speaking English. That's natural for them, easy for them, to varying degrees, of course, because we vary on all abilities, and language skill being one of them. And other people have learned English as a second, third, fourth, or whatever language. And so they are not working in their native language. So fluent English speakers, which would include the first native language English speakers, have to work to be less dominant. It's very tempting to get frustrated in a meeting because someone can't find a word or they're struggling to express themselves, to kind of take over, either by finishing their sentence for them or by simply ignoring them and carrying on and just kind of shuffling them off to the corner because they're too slow to keep up. So you're not supposed to do that. You have to give them time to finish their thought. That's respectful. And realizing that English may not be their native language, so they're just not as fluent. Less fluent English speakers need to be more engaged. So if you're the one who is struggling with English as the work language, because maybe in your day-to-day life at home and with your friends and family, you use another language or two, and English is this thing you use for some classes that you attend, then you have to work at it. You made the decision to study in English and work with teams in English, And now's the time that we're demanding you step up to that decision you made for yourself and work at delivering in English. And it's hard. It's difficult. I'm saying, like, I don't know, because I don't ever do that. I speak some French, but not enough to be called anywhere near fluent. And I never work in another language. But this is what people say, right? All team members work to increase inclusion. You have to be especially careful with global teams, or you could say distance teams, to make sure everyone has a chance to speak and is heard, and pay attention to who's got their microphone on with Zoom or another distance platform, and get everyone a chance to speak. I have more detail on the next slide on language with global teams. Identity. Our team has many cultures. Everyone is a teacher and a learner. So that's the whole idea of global teams, that we're here working together and we're learning together, and that's a good thing. So sometimes we're the teacher. Here's how, I know about this. Here's what I know. And sometimes we're like, okay, I need to learn from you now. Maybe it's technology, which is up next. Team members take, I'm still on identity. Team members take on more responsibility for the development of the team as a whole. You can't leave this to the professor. You can't leave it to a team leader, whether it's an official one or kind of a default, someone stepped into that role, because a team often needs a leader in a role. They take on more, everyone takes responsibility for how the team is doing. And then technology. We work hard to decide when we should be in instant communication, which is also called synchronous, and when we should use other media and platforms such as message boards and emails. And there's many technologies for distance whiteboards where you can leave messages and they'll still be there, and whiteboards where you can work on them at the same time and everyone can see what's being worked on. So technology is a decision that has to be made. How are we going to use which technologies? And you also have to help each other with those technologies, because some people don't have the right equipment. Some people don't have the right knowledge. They haven't learned yet. So you have to help them. And then I also have an HBR video as an option in a series called The Explainer, how to collaborate effectively if your team is remote. Again, so they're a few minutes long, and they're usually sort of fun and sort of informative. This is the last in that series. Of course, there's an article that this is from, and you could read the article if if you want to know more. And then again, I've given an HBR video called Managing Multicultural Teams, if you want to look at that. It's not required. And then this is another exhibit from that article, that fluent speakers should dial down the dominance. Less fluent speakers should dial up engagement, and team leaders should balance for inclusion, with lots of really useful bullet points. So fluent speakers, how do you dial down your dominance? Because it's really easy to fall into this trap. Slow down the pace, how fast you speak, and use familiar language, less idioms. So, someone might, an American especially, I think they say this a lot. They say something like, well, that dog won't hunt. And, the first time I heard this, like, what? And it means when someone's in a group meeting and they say, this is what we should do, and someone else says, well, that dog won't hunt, they mean it won't work. And I think what they mean is when you have a bunch of dogs and one of them won't hunt, they can't be in the pack. So don't use idioms and acronyms and things that are, you always have to think, does everyone know what I'm saying? when you're a fluent speaker. Number 2, refrain from dominating the conversation, especially if you're an extrovert. It's so fun, you know? It's so fun to be the one in charge and leading the conversation. And sometimes, though, it's because you're the fluent speaker. And so you have to learn to step back. Ask people, actively ask, do you understand what I'm saying? And then wait. And don't say it condescendingly. Do you understand what I'm saying? Do you? No. It's like empathetically. Do you understand what I'm saying? Kind of factual. And then they say no. Okay. And then you have to try to explain it another way, a simpler way, simpler words, maybe. Listen actively. Listen, there's a whole thing on listening actively that we'll probably do in chapter on communication. Active listening means it's hard work, and your brain is not thinking about what you're going to say next. Your brain is focusing on what they're saying now. And sometimes people have a pen and paper and they take notes as they're listening, and then note taking, you never save those notes, but they're used as a mechanism for focusing on the other person. Less fluent speakers need to dial up engagement, get more engaged, dial it up, just like a rheostat light switch, it's dim, it's medium, it's bright, dial it up. Resist withdrawal or other avoidance behaviors. It's so easy to just give up. It's like, wow, this is too hard. I can't follow what they're saying. They're speaking too fast. Maybe the technology's got a lag in it. It's just difficult. So it's easy to give up. So you're supposed to resist that urge. It's okay to have the urge. It's not okay to give up. Refrain from reverting to your native language. Also, I'm told, very tempting, especially during break time. There's a break, so people just start talking with their own languages to the ones who speak them. And so you never really meet, in this casual sense, the other people on the team. If you're in an English-speaking meeting, which I'm assuming, because that's the only language I speak, those are the only meetings I'm in. I've been in meetings where there's an interpreter. Like I was in a meeting with South Koreans one time, and you talk to them, you look at them, you speak to them, and then you pause and the interpreter speaks. And then they speak and they're looking at you, and then the interpreter speaks. It's slow, but it kind of works. So refrain from reverting to your native language. Ask, do you understand what I am saying? Am I getting through? Because you might be using English in a way that they're not anticipating. That's very common. If you learned your English in another country and culture, which I presume is common, the teachers can have ways, things they think are normal or the way English works, that in an English-speaking country, it's not that way anymore. Things have moved on. I often notice students who write papers for me in courses, and they're from other cultures, and so English is not their first language. They will use English words that haven't been used in a long time. And so it's just, wow, like sometimes it's, what's that word? And sometimes I see the word and I think, oh, well, they just don't know the way we use language like now. If you don't understand others, ask them to repeat or explain. That's okay. It's going to take longer with global teams, with distance teams. It's more tiring. It's going to take longer. And team leaders, especially if this is your formal job, but also someone has to kind of do this job, and it can rotate around the team. Monitor participants and strive to balance their speaking and listening. Make sure everyone gets semi-equal time. And that means, of course, the fluent speakers who are being dominant have to be dialed down by the team leader. Politely, it's like, okay, everyone needs a chance to speak, and I'm calling on this person. And then the fluent speaker interrupts. And it's like, yeah, we're just going to wait. We'll have a chance to, everyone needs to have a chance to speak. It's now this other person's turn. I don't know, something like that. Actively draw contributions from all team members. Solicit participation from less fluent speakers in particular, and be prepared to define and interpret content. This last one is tricky. Sometimes you, as team leader, have to say, this is what it means. This is how I am interpreting what it means. So the professor has written a syllabus and an instruction for a project assignment, and a team leader sometimes has to say, okay, I've read it. I'm telling you, this is my interpretation. This is what it means. And maybe you'll check with the professor and maybe you won't. But you have to say, I'm calling it. This is it. This is what it means. And that's your job.